We've all seen or read works like Lord of the Rings, or any of the old fantasy stories, where elves, humans and dwarves travel across the lands, often visiting taverns and pubs, quaffing tankards of ale before retiring for the night in a wooden bed. We're all familiar with it. We've seen movies where Romans drink until the long hours, with women draped over the arms before staggering back home through dark cobbled streets. But how realistic are these scenes? And what would you actually expect from an old drinking establishment back in those days? More importantly, what would you expect to drink? Was it really just ale and wine? So I'll take you on a virtual pub crawl through history, visiting everything from the complete dives of medieval cities to the monasteries that distilled alcohol from medicinal purposes. Well, let's get stuck in, shall we? I'll start by explaining that I deal in history, not prehistory, and my focus is on the medieval period. But history's oldest drinks do certainly need a mention. So let's go right back into ancient times. And boy, we're a long way off from making White Russians and Negroni. The good old-fashioned humble beer has been going around for thousands of years. And in ancient Mesopotamia, they had a goddess called Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing beer. Recorded in 2 clay tablets just short of 4,000 years ago and written in cuneiform, it is the first known beer recipe, meaning we can replicate it, but though it's not what we'd expect from a beer, mainly made from barley. It was more of a bread tasting dry affair. Served in clay jugs, you drank it through a straw. It wasn't very strong, more a mid-strength beer, just over 3%, but given there were no hops back then, the beverage wouldn't keep long, and you'd have to drink it pretty quick, so the desired effect of getting drunk would still be achieved. Ancient Egyptians were obsessed with beer also, as it was an important part of their civilization. They even made figurines depicting the mass production of the beverage, and their goddess of beer was Chidinet, so there is already a pattern of beer being associated with women. A trend that would continue right into the Middle Ages, where it would be women that predominantly brewed it. A household task as common as baking bread. As Christianity became the ruling religion of Europe, the old goddesses of beer fell out of favour. But all was not lost, as in the 5th century AD we have St Bridget, an Irish abbess from Kildare, who would turn water into beer, not just once, but it seemed to be something she was rather good at. There's even a medieval poem where she envisions heaven as a massive ale festival, with God and all the angels getting blind drunk in a lake of beer. Yes, since history began, beer was very much the woman's profession. Though as we passed into actual history, it became the main drink of the peasantry, as wine had taken over as the drink of the upper classes. Well, to say taken over, wine itself is much older than beer, going back a whopping great 8,000 years. And a wine would be anything involving fruit. Perries, ciders, they were wines. And they'd often be watered down, even spiced. The classical period was full of wine connoisseurs, from ancient Greece to the Romans. Even back then, the region was important, as was the vintage. Pictures of burly men enjoying the grapes of the gods were just as popular. And back in the Iron Age, beer was considered uncouth, wine was king. As for England, they tended to make white wines, though if you were to head to an English tavern in the 12th century, during the reign of Henry II, the popular wine was claret, due to the king's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Back then it was a nice, sweet, pink drink, imported from Bordeaux. Naturally, the aristocracy were hogging all the best stuff, but that is not to say that the taverns were not stocked. They were. Even after King John lost the continental lands in the 13th century, the popularity of claret did not wane. But anyway. As time would press on, the image would change from chaps sitting about drinking through straws to the mugs and the cups we are more familiar with.
Pint of stiller, please, Horus.
As for spirits, even though we knew the distilling process pretty early on by the classical period, the use doesn't seem to have been applied to alcohol. That would come later. And by the 13th century, we have people distilling wine. Yep, the good old brandy wine. And again, wine is anything with fruit, so apples, pears, brandy wine. Basically, brandy. If you could distill it, you could drink it, like with aquavite. Spirits like vodka do appear in early forms, and with no reference to potatoes, of course. Just don't expect to see these in taverns and alehouses. These are strictly medicinal use. Yeah, and pigs fly. You can just imagine what's going on behind the scenes. There was also mead, a drink made with honey which was also popular. In the Proas Edda, Thor famously gets drunk on mead when the Jötnar trick him into quaffing from a giant drinking horn. He fails and loses wrestling match, can't even pick up a cat. Anyway, mead is falling out of favour during the Middle Ages. It's terribly expensive, so you're not likely to see it in any of the drinking establishments that we're going to come across. And this pretty much brings us up to date with where we need to be at. Where the Iron Age passes the torch to the medieval, a period that itself will age like a good fine wine. But what about beverages like lagers, the Hefeweizen? Some of these breweries boast going back to the 13th century. Well, sure, occasionally there was a brewery or an abbey back in the day on that spot, or at least a spot where they were originally founded, but alas, now it's nothing more than a marketing campaign. Eventually hops become popular. They've already been around for a while, especially in places like the Netherlands and Belgium, but are slowly becoming to dominate the beverages of the age, sort of around the Renaissance period. Hops kept the beer lasting longer, and people tended to like the more bitter taste. As for lagers, they are not really a thing around now, far more of a later drink. And the classic fizzy stuff won't be around for centuries. They certainly wouldn't have a widget. It's not that you couldn't carbonate a beer. I'm referring to the modern cold fizzy beers that you find in Europe or the States. Simply weren't around. But a beer with a good head on it, oh god, most definitely. So, now we're familiar with what to drink, let's try and find a good place to sit down and have a pint. And like the characters in the fantasy genre, we'll no doubt enter the first place we see, maybe even find a bite to eat, possibly a bed for the night. Now firstly, I'm ruling out the nobility, as we all know what they're up to in their great halls, enjoying their feasts with copious amounts of the best wine Normandy can offer. I'm more interested right now in where to go out for a cheeky pint and a bit of grub. I'll start with the cliché tavern. Right, the term tavern gets blurred and intermingled nowadays. Tavern, pub, inn, alehouse, bar, all pretty much the same thing. They sell a range of beers and other spirits and beverages, possibly even a bed for the night, if you're booked 6 years in advance. But back in the medieval times, there were very much different places. Right now I'm dealing with actual taverns. So, arriving in town, we imagine seeing the rickety wooden building with a jovial sign waving in the wind, and the warm smell of the fire and some cheers from inside. Well, you're not too far off, as you would certainly be greeted by the classic medieval building, whether built of stone or timber, whether a thatched roof or tiles. And there would most likely be a sign, as signage was popular. Ideally pictorial, as not everyone could read. It might have a coat of arms because it might be linked to a guild. It might have a mug on it. Either way, you got the picture. But upon entering, you'd be surprised by what you'd see, because the tavern is basically a wine bar, effectively. Taverns have certainly changed over the years. So first I'll explain what a tavern is. The name comes from taberna, but the Romans would probably ask you to be more specific, as taberna was just a type of retail unit. So in the same way you'll have to specify clothes store, hardware store or bookstore, you'll find yourself confronted with taberna libraria or taberna vinaria. And it is the taberna vinaria that evolves into the classic tavern. And in the classical period, on the off chance that the one you're drinking in didn't sell food, there were many vendors on the street that did. Hey boss, what would you like? Hey, would you like kebab? Everything's here. Everything's here. You've got salad, chili sauce. By the Middle Ages, we're seeing something more in line with today's expectation of a tavern. Groups of people sitting around enjoying the wines and eating some form of pub grub. Food could be anything from a roast to some cheese and bread. They might not sell any at all. It all depends on where you are, and in the late medieval period, the French taverns were pretty much a proto-restaurant. As I said a moment ago, they are a wine bar, and often more upmarket establishments. Though, by upmarket, we're still talking peasantry, just ones more better off. Look at it like this. The average wage is roughly 2 pence a day for an unskilled worker. 4 pints of wine could be double your income. And if you wanted the fine sweet stuff from France or Normandy, quadruple your income. You simply had to be on a better wage bracket. Basically, skilled work, or professional. Carpenter, you could easily be on 4 pence a day. A good priest would be on 5 pence a day, and this is double the wages of a labourer. These people can afford a wine or two. Taverns are run by vintners, who have their own guild, which is good as it means there are checks on quality, etc. So expect good wine, and in this period, the sweeter the better. And if the vintner sold shoddy wine or engaged in nefarious practices, he could find himself in the stocks, as the guilds had a reputation to protect. Probably had his wine tipped over his head for good measure. Taverns are still primarily drinking establishments, so rather than families sitting about nibbling round a table, expect an often rowdy affair where people are often sloshed, just with the added benefit of possibly being able to get food. And even though they fall out of favour in various parts of Europe during the Middle Ages, they are still going strong in places like England and France. And occasionally these places do have beds for the night, which leads us into inns. Inns are pretty much a tavern, complete with stables for the horses and a place to park the wagon. There may even be plenty of rooms for overnight stay, and travellers would expect to be fed and the drink flowing. Even back in the Roman times, these places were about, as no sooner had they paved the first major roads than the first inns popped up. Supply and demand. And these inns pretty much made a network across the travel routes. After all, travellers didn't want to spend the night sleeping in the fields, especially if you weren't shy of a few denarii. There's an inn at Herculaneum that is the size of a street block. Colossal, a huge villa. People using inns of this size are pretty much living in a luxury, with little reason to leave the inn's walls. It's simply huge. But like the rest of Herculaneum, this inn wasn't cheap. Because, again, like the taverns, they'd be more upmarket, as your average pleb isn't going to be travelling across Europe. Most peasants couldn't afford it. These would be people like traders, pilgrims, clergy, professionals, anyone with enough coin to be able to travel. So already we're in the wage bracket required to frequent taverns. Then just ramp it up a bit. Like with everything else, the quality of inns can vary. You are most likely going to share a room with several other people, even sleep on a straw pallet. Beds are a luxury item. Even if it did have a bed, you can expect to share it with others. That's just how the day and age worked. You could even just crash out in the main hall with the others, in just a blanket. But here, at least there's a roaring fire, which doesn't sound like a bad idea. Of course, there's even the stables. The biblical story of Joseph and Mary trolling around for an inn has grounds in historicity. If for some reason or other the inn was to be full, then stables it is. And it's certainly a better option than sleeping out in the open, because you don't want to be woken up by a piglet. Inns could just as well be an enclosed affair, much like a villa, with several other buildings included, like your stables, maybe even a boarding house. So more akin to the bed and breakfast affairs we're used to today, full with staff rushing about to cater for people's needs. If you're lucky, they could even be attached or adjacent to a monastery or other religious building. As often it was the monks that brewed beer and pressed grapes. I suppose without many women present, the monks had to get their hands dirty. And if they were distilling wines, you might even have access to the medicinal good stuff. And going by the Christmas exploits of the clergy, they are certainly not shy of a good time. I'm only adding the monasteries to the list, as sure you're not going to pop into your local monastery and join the monks in a cheeky pint. Well, you might. You could yourself be a monk on his travels. You could be a pilgrim, or any type of other clergyman. And it's not like the monastery is firmly closed to the outside. They have their own community and outbuildings, separate from the monastic life. Like I mentioned before, they might even be attached to an inn or a tavern, and were unlikely to turn away a traveller. After all, there are biblical stories that encourage hospitality. It was the Christian thing to do. Hospitality? You also get into the realm of hospitals, as hospitals themselves were pretty much hostels, almshouses, places of refuge, not just for the sick, but also the poor. Again, the domain of the clergy. So you could definitely expect accommodation in these places and hospitality. And monks weren't just stuffy Bible bashers with no social life. Far from it. Our best bawdy tales are often written by the monks, and one of the first instances of the F word was written by a monk and directed at his abbot. Yes. So don't rule out a monastery as a place to get a drink. I suppose in one way you could look at it like a modern-day cider farm. You could easily take a wagon down to your local monastery and pick up a good vintage or two. Don't be too hasty to rule these things out. In the Middle Ages, anything can happen. And these monks may well have their own vineyard, brewery or distillery, which may make its way into the taverns of the local town. The abbot's best. A nice local brew, good enough for the church. But so far we've only really been dealing with the other half of society, because the people who frequent the inns and the taverns are pretty well off in comparison to the regular peasantry.
Friendly dog, I've never had that before.
Sure, they're not aristocracy, but they are not living hand to mouth, fearful of the next bad harvest. So let's meet the people who made the backbone of society, the tradies, the farmers, the rat catchers, the muckers. So we're heading off to one of the many alehouses that can be found all over Europe, and just about anywhere with the ability to brew ale. Which brings us back to the women, as the humble alewife is the cornerstone of the alehouse. An alehouse is most likely going to be a peasant's house, one that has a reputation for brewing ale. Once the ale is brewed, she'll stick a broom above the doorway or some item, indicating to everyone that there is a nice supply of ale and the shop's open. Very casual affairs where workers could take a load off and relax. Peasants' houses would often have animals loitering about, not pets, but cows, dogs, working animals, like chickens, plus a gaggle of children, no doubt being pests, while all the adults drank. Although they are most likely going to be joining in, to be honest. It's a very lax day and age, especially at this end of the scale, but everyone knows each other. And some alehouses will have a better reputation than others, and might have a more permanent residence. Your classic old-fashioned public house. Well, yes, the pub, as we know it, is a creation of Victorian England. But all they did was added rules and regulations, licences as such, concepts which have been going along since the Renaissance, as the humble alehouse made its slow evolution into the good old-fashioned pub. I will say at once, don't expect a pint. The average measure is roughly 2 pints. I say roughly because there's no exact measures for most of the period, and many unscrupulous alehouses exist here. And alehouses have been going around since before the Romans, and have endured ever since. Places where people can gather, socialise, even find work and trade. It is the hub of the community, as we travel past the classic period and into the medieval. Going back to wages, which are worked out at roughly 2 pence a day. Blimey, you could get a gallon for a penny. That's 8 pints for half your wage. And when Magna Carta kicks in around 12:15, no, not in the afternoon, the date, the measures become law. So you're getting more bang for your buck, so to speak. Hang on, I hear you say. Half a daily wage for 8 pints? Christ on a bike! That's around 25 quid a pint. No, wages worked out differently back then. Prices worked out differently. There were different wants for different things which had different prices for different items. All we need to know is beer was absolutely cheap. Having a cheeky flagon or two in the Black Pig, coming home from work at the construction site, that is Salisbury Cathedral, this wouldn't dent the paycheck. And in the West Country of England, a cider is getting a reputation of being the drink of the peasantry. Yes, it's a wine, but these have figured a way of making their own version of it. And this isn't your nice, sweet affair. These are rough, dry, strong ciders, cloudy with sediment. A peasant's drink. So these ales or ciders would be your drink.
Okay, so I'm at the bar, and I've got an empty glass. So the barman's like, would you like another? And I'm like, yeah, sure. So give me another empty glass.
Other parts of Europe evolved in one way or other, pretty much keeping the idea of the tavern, where food and drink are enjoyed in a restaurant kind of setting, more akin to the French taverns of the Middle Ages. But you will not find food, or most likely won't find food, in an English alehouse. It's a house that sells ale. You don't need food. The chances are your wife has got it on the table back home. And that still continues today with the classic British boozer, which might sell bar snacks like pork scratchings or nuts. Buckley's chance of anything else. Now, while I was in Naples, I see a place that calls itself an English pub. It looks nothing like an English pub, and would look out of place in the UK, until you realise that it's the concept of a pub, the public house idea. Once you strip away the Italian beers and the French-looking decor, you do in fact have the idea of a modern British pub. But in the Middle Ages, we are far from the modern concept of a public house. We're often in the rural West Country, where a gaggle of peasants have just finished a hard day's toil, working the Lord's land, and are enjoying some nice cider or ale. You could find yourself in a town where an alehouse has opened its doors to the labourers who have been working on that new construction site. Lads on a good night out, away from their masons and chippies in the tavern down the road. And maybe you've wandered into a rough dive in the poor area of town, where you've got to keep your wits. And many of the alehouses were drunken affairs with bad reputations. So it really depends where you are as what to expect. And there we have it, really. Some of the main drinking establishments in the old days, discounting the Renaissance and the Victorians, keeping to the medieval with a dash of Roman, segueing through Sumeria, ancient Egypt and Greece. We've seen some of the best wines that history has to offer, and some of the greatest ales. Now, next time you're in a good old pub, with the wooden beams and a rickety look, just think of the history of the place, its age, who used to drink there, what local legends are remembered. It could be older than the Tudors. Thank you for watching.